The candles in the dining room at Halford Park numbered 46, and Eleanor Graves had counted every one of them, because counting was the only employment available to a woman seated at the far end of a table where no one intended to speak to her. She had been placed beyond the curate's wife, and below the steward's elderly mother. In the last chair before the sideboard, where the footman's elbow nearly caught her temple each time he passed with the soup. The Dowager Duchess of Halford had arranged the seating herself. Eleanor's position was not an accident. It was a verdict. At the table's head, 30 feet and an entire social order away, the Duke of Halford sat with his jaw held at the angle of a man who found his own dinner party mildly punishing. He had spoken twice since the first course, both times to the gentleman on his left, and both times in sentences so short that the candles between them had barely flickered. His face was severe, composed, and gave nothing. His eyes, however, had traveled the length of the table once already, and stopped on Eleanor for 3 full seconds before returning to his glass. She had not noticed. Lady Sophronia Hale had. Sophronia leaned toward Mrs. Fenimore, her voice low enough to perform discretion and loud enough to ensure Eleanor heard every syllable. "She is merely the pen," Sophronia said, lifting her wine without looking down the table. "One does not seat the pen at dinner. I cannot imagine what Margaret was thinking." Mrs. Fenimore covered her smile with a gloved hand. Eleanor's own hand tightened on the napkin in her lap, her thumb pressing white against the linen until the knuckle ached. Her face did not change. 5 months in this house had taught her the cost of a visible flinch, and she had learned to keep her flinches where they belonged, which was beneath the table, in the fabric, in the small hidden cruelties she performed on her own composure rather than let the room see her break. The season outside was late autumn, the windows black, the park beyond them stripped to its bones. She matched it. She had been hired to write the Dowager's letters, and letters did not require a face. If you have ever walked into a room and felt the air close around you like water, you already know the shape of Eleanor's evening. Stay close. The Duke's gaze returned to her once more as the second course arrived. This time it lingered on the plain gray silk of her dress, the only unadorned fabric at a table of embroidered satin, and on her hands, which were still and pale against the dark napkin. His own hand paused on the stem of his glass, a hesitation so brief that no one at the table registered it except, perhaps, the footman who had been watching the Duke's glass all evening and now found it unpredictably full. Then he looked away, and the pause became nothing, and the dinner continued as though she had never been there at all. Eleanor Graves had arrived at Halford Park in June, carrying 1 trunk, 1 letter of reference from a dead clergyman's widow, and a debt of £200 that sat on her shoulders the way certain debts do. Not as weight exactly, more as weather, a constant gray pressure she could feel in her chest each morning before she opened her eyes. Her father, the Reverend Mr. Graves, had died the previous winter, owing money to the apothecary, the coal merchant, and 3 tradesmen in the village of Hartwell who had extended credit on the strength of a living that died with the man who held it. Eleanor had buried him in a borrowed black dress, the hem taken up with pins, because the dress belonged to a taller woman, and there had not been time to sew it. She had sold the piano first, then the books, then the writing desk she had used since she was 12, the one with the ink stain on the left corner, where her father had once demonstrated the correct angle for a nib and pressed too hard. The debts remained. They were patient creditors, and patient creditors were the worst kind because they did not shout. They simply appeared at the post office each month when Eleanor collected her wages, and their silence had a particular weight, and the weight was the shape of her name. The Dowager Duchess had hired her on the strength of 1 sample letter. Eleanor had written it in the parlor of a London employment agency, while 3 other women waited on the bench behind her, each of them older, each of them more visibly desperate. and each of them wearing gloves that had been mended at the fingertips more than once. The dowager had read the letter, examined Eleanor over the top of the page the way one examines a horse or a writing instrument, and said, "You will do. You will write what I tell you to write. You will not speak at meals, and you will not enter the West Wing without permission. Your salary is £40 per annum." £40 was not a life. It was the outline of one, drawn in very faint pencil, erasable at any moment. Eleanor had accepted. Her duties were particular and consuming. The dowager's hands trembled, not from age alone, but from a palsy that had worsened since the previous duke's death, and her correspondence was vast. Letters to solicitors, to distant cousins contesting a clause in the late duke's will, to the vicar regarding the almshouse roof, to old friends in London and Bath, whose names the dowager pronounced with the careful precision of someone who would rather die than admit she could no longer hold a pen steady enough to write them. Eleanor sat each morning in the small study off the dowager's rooms, at a desk positioned so the light fell on the page rather than her face, took dictation, and produced in her own clear hand the words Margaret Ashworth would have written had her fingers still obeyed her. She was good at it. She was good at disappearing into another woman's voice, at hearing the dowager's clipped cadence and reproducing it on the page so faithfully that even Margaret, reading the finished letter back with her spectacles held in one trembling hand, would nod once and say, "Yes, that is what I meant." The desk was walnut, old, and smelled faintly of beeswax and iron gall ink. Eleanor knew every scratch on its surface, every drawer that stuck in damp weather. What the dowager did not know, and what Eleanor had never told her, was that sometimes, late in the evening, after the dictation was done, and the house had gone quiet, and the candles in the servants' corridor had been put out one by one, Eleanor sat at the same desk and wrote letters the dowager had not asked for. Letters to no one. Letters in which she allowed herself to say the things the dowager's voice could not hold. Letters full of warmth and plain grief, and the kind of tenderness that Margaret Ashworth would have called vulgar, and that Eleanor Graves called necessary, though she called it nothing aloud. She kept them in a leather folio beneath her mattress, clasped with a small brass lock her father had given her on her 16th birthday. All except one. The Duke of Halford had come to the park 3 months earlier, arriving without announcement on a Tuesday morning in a carriage so plain it might have belonged to a country surgeon. Eleanor had watched from the upstairs window as he crossed the gravel, his coat dark, his hat pulled low against a sky the color of pewter, his stride the measured walk of a man who did not expect welcome and did not require it. He was tall. His shoulders carried the particular tension of someone who has held himself upright so long he has forgotten that sitting down is an option. He had not visited in 2 years. The household knew why, though no one said it aloud, and the silence around the reason had taken on the quality of a piece of furniture everyone walked around without acknowledging. His father, the 5th Duke, had died slowly over the course of a winter, and the dowager had not gone to him. She had remained in the dower house, 14 miles from the main estate where her husband lay dying, and she had sent letters. Formal, correct, measured, and cold as the flagstones in the chapel, where the 5th Duke was eventually laid to rest in March. The son had read them. He had not replied. The silence between mother and son had calcified into something that looked, from the outside, like a house in perfect order, every surface polished, every appointment kept, and inside, nothing. Eleanor had learned the shape of it within her first week. The dowager never mentioned her son by his Christian name. She said, "the Duke," or "Halford," or, when she was particularly stiff, "His Grace," pronouncing the title the way one pronounces the name of an institution rather than a person. The Duke, for his part, dined with his mother on Tuesdays and Fridays, spoke to her with the grave courtesy of a man addressing a committee, and left the table before the cloth was drawn. They occupied the same house the way two clocks occupied the same mantle, each keeping its own time, neither acknowledging the other's ticking. On the morning after the dinner party, Eleanor rose before dawn and carried her folio to the library. The library at Halford Park was a long room paneled in walnut, with windows that faced east and caught the first gray light before any fire was lit, and shelves that climbed to a ceiling painted with a scene of Apollo and the Muses so darkened by age that the Muses looked less like divine inspiration and more like women waiting in a queue. She had discovered in her second month that if she arrived before 5, she could sit at the long reading table by the east window and write for an hour without interruption, without explanation, without being seen by anyone whose seeing would cost her. She did not hear him come in. The Duke stood in the doorway for a full minute before she looked up, one hand resting on the doorframe, his weight settled against it, as though he had been there long enough to have considered leaving, and decided against it. When she did look up, the shock of his presence rearranged her posture so completely that the pen slipped and left a blot on the page she had been writing. A dark spreading circle that consumed the word tenderness and turned it into a stain. He was dressed, though barely, his cravat loose and unknotted, his coat absent, his shirt sleeves visible at the wrist in a way that would have been unremarkable in any other man, and was, in the Duke of Halford, a kind of confession. His face was unreadable. His eyes moved from her face to the pen to the blotted page and back. "You are here early, Miss Graves." "I could not sleep, Your Grace." She closed the folio. Her hand was not steady. She pressed it flat against the leather. "Nor could I." He did not move from the doorway. "What are you writing?" "Correspondence, Your Grace." "My mother's correspondence requires you at 4 in the morning." "My own, Your Grace." He studied her. The light from the east window was thin and gray, and fell across his face in a way that made the bones of it very clear. The high forehead, the jaw that looked as though it had been designed for endurance rather than ornament, the eyes that were neither warm nor cold, but simply, at this hour, unguarded. Then he stepped into the room, crossed to the far shelf, and pulled a volume without checking the spine. He sat at the opposite end of the table, 8 feet away, opened the book, and did not speak again. They sat in silence for the remainder of the hour. Eleanor's pen scratched. The light moved. The house began to wake below them, the distant sounds of the kitchen grate being raked. A door opened, a pail set down. When she gathered her things to leave, she passed behind his chair, and as she did, she heard the kitchen door open below, and a sound she recognized. The particular hiccup of a child trying very hard not to cry. She put the folio down on the hall table. She went downstairs. The scullery girl was called Annie, and she was perhaps 12, and she had burned her hand on the grate so badly that the skin had already begun to blister across 3 fingers. The cook had not yet arrived. The kitchen was cold, the fire barely caught, and Annie was kneeling on the flagstones with her burned hand pressed against her apron, her face contorted with the effort of keeping silent, because crying in the kitchen before dawn was the sort of thing that lost you a position. Eleanor knelt beside her. She did not ring for the housekeeper. She did not call for the cook. She took Annie's hand and turned it palm up and examined the burn with the quick, careful attention of someone who had dressed her own father's wounds through a long winter of fevers, someone who knew that wounds required clean cloth and cold water, and a voice, and that the voice mattered more than either of the other two. She wrapped the hand in a cold cloth. She soaked herself at the pump, speaking quietly, telling Annie about a kitchen cat she had known as a girl who had once knocked an entire rack of cooling pies onto the floor and been forgiven because the cook was in love with the gardener and in too good a humor to punish anyone. Annie stopped crying. Eleanor's hem was black with ash where she had knelt on the hearthstone. She did not notice, or did not care. The Duke stood on the landing above, where the servants' stair met the main corridor. One hand gripped the banister. His knuckles were white. He watched Eleanor rise, watched her brush the ash from her knees with the matter-of-fact gesture of a woman who has knelt on worse floors, watched Annie clutch the wrapped hand to her chest and look up at Eleanor with an expression that was not gratitude exactly, more the stunned recognition of a child who has been treated with care by someone who was not obligated to provide it. His jaw tightened. He turned and went back upstairs before Eleanor could see him, and the staircase kept his secret. And his face, for a long moment, was the face of a man who has just seen something he was not prepared to see. That afternoon, the Dowager dictated a letter to her son. It was 3 lines long. It concerned the drainage of the south field and the cost of repairing 2 tenant cottages on the east boundary. Eleanor wrote it exactly as dictated, sealed it with the Dowager's crest, and set it on the silver tray for the footman. Then she sat for a long time, looking at the Dowager's hands where they rested on the arms of her chair, the fingers curled inward, the knuckles swollen and reddened, the tremor visible even in stillness, a constant small vibration like something trapped beneath the skin. "Will that be all, Your Grace?" "That will be all." Eleanor rose. She paused at the door. "Your Grace, shall I add at the close that you hope the Duke is well?" The Dowager's chin lifted. Her face, in profile, had the quality of carved ivory, handsome and closed. "I have said what I wished to say, Miss Graves. You may go." Eleanor went to her room. She sat at her small desk beneath the window that looked out over the kitchen garden, where the last runner beans had gone to straw, and the soil was the color of cold tea. She took a clean sheet of paper. She dipped her pen, and she wrote, in her own hand, a letter she had no authority to write. A letter that began, "My dear James," and continued for 2 pages in a voice that was not the Dowager's, and was not quite her own. It was the voice of a mother who had not known how to cross the distance between her chair and her dying husband's bed, who had sat in the next room and listened to his breathing change through the wall and done nothing, not from cruelty and not from indifference, only from a terror so complete it had locked her body to the chair the way a winter locks a river. The letter said she was sorry. It said she had loved him, meaning the 5th Duke, meaning the husband who had died while she sat frozen 14 miles away. The letter said she had written 100 letters since, and had not managed to say this in any of them. The letter asked forgiveness. Eleanor folded it. She sealed it with plain wax from her own candle, not the Dowager's crest, and the wax was the color of tallow, pale and common. She placed it on the tray with the evening correspondence, beneath the Dowager's official letter about drainage, and when the footman carried the tray away, Eleanor sat alone in her room and pressed her hands flat on the desk and felt them shake. The Duke read his mother's letter about drainage first. He set it aside on the desk in his study without expression, beside a stack of similar letters that dated back 2 years, each one containing the same careful nothing. Then he opened the second letter, the one sealed in plain wax, and the wax crumbled differently under his thumb, lighter, less assured. He read it standing at the window of his study, where a portrait of the 5th Duke hung turned to the wall because the 6th Duke could not bear the eyes. He read it twice. His hand went to the back of the chair beside him. and he gripped it the way a man grips a railing in a high wind, and his face did something it had not done in 2 years. It moved. He had been 17 when his mother had last called him James. She had called him Halford since his 20th birthday. And before that, she had called him the boy. And before that, she had called him nothing at all. Because the nursery was the governess's province. And Margaret Ashworth did not enter provinces that were not hers. The wound was not dramatic. It was simply an absence that had lasted his entire life. A mother who had been correct in every particular and warm in none, and when his father had died and the letters came, each one formal, each one signed with her full title, each one empty of the single word he had needed, which was his name, the absence had hardened into something he no longer tried to climb over. He had inherited the title, the estate, the tenants, the debts, and a mother who wrote to him as though he were a committee report. He had stopped expecting anything else 2 years ago, on the morning of his father's funeral, when the dowager's letter of condolence contained 4 lines, and none of them said James, and none of them said I am sorry, and none of them said I loved him. The letter in his hand said all 3. He folded it carefully and placed it inside the breast pocket of his coat, against his chest, where it pressed like a second heartbeat against the waistcoat. Then he went to find Miss Graves. He found her in the corridor outside his mother's rooms, carrying a stack of completed letters for the Evening Post. "Miss Graves, come inside, sit down." His voice was low, level, stripped of everything except the command itself. She obeyed. Though her pulse was visible at her throat, a small, rapid flutter against the skin above her collar that she could not have hidden if she had tried, and she sat in the chair he indicated and folded her hands and waited. He closed the door. He held up the letter, the plain wax seal already broken, the paper creased where his hand had gripped it. "This is not my mother's hand. No, Your Grace. This is your hand." "Yes." "Did she ask you to write this?" Eleanor's chin lifted. The same gesture, she realized too late, that the dowager used. "No, she did not." "Then why?" "Because someone ought to have written it, Your Grace. Because your mother sits in that chair every afternoon and dictates 3 lines about drainage, and her hands shake, and her voice does not shake, and I have learned to hear the difference." He was quiet. The letter trembled in his hand. He looked at it, and then at her, and then at the letter again, and his face held an expression she could not name. Something between gratitude and grief, and the raw confusion of a man who has received something he wanted from someone who had no obligation to give it. "Do not leave this house, Miss Graves," he said. He walked out of the room. The command was protection. She heard only the command. If you are still listening, what comes next is the moment the season turns. Eleanor did not know it yet. The Michaelmas Assembly at the village hall arrived the following week, a gathering of local gentry and county families hosted by Sir William Parish and attended by every person within 12 miles who owned a carriage or could borrow one. The Duke rarely attended. This year he did. He arrived with his mother on his arm, a sight so unprecedented that the room's conversation died for 3 full seconds, a silence that moved across the assembly like the shadow of a cloud crossing a field, and then recovered itself with the determined cheerfulness of people who have decided not to acknowledge what they have just seen. Eleanor came in the dowager's wake, dressed in the same gray silk, carrying the dowager's wrap, positioned at the correct distance behind her employer, invisible in the manner she had been hired to perform. Lady Sophronia was already there, standing near the musicians in a gown of pale green silk that caught the candlelight at every seam. She watched the Duke cross the assembly floor. She watched his mother settle into a chair. She watched Eleanor fold the wrap over the chair's back and step away into the margin of the room, and Sophronia's mouth curved into the particular smile of a woman who has already been told the outcome and is simply waiting for the formalities to conclude. "The companion," Sophronia said to the Duke when he paused near her group. Her voice carried the polish of certainty. "She is furniture, Your Grace. Surely you do not notice furniture." The Duke's jaw tightened. He said nothing. He moved past Sophronia toward the window, where he stood alone with his hands behind his back, and Eleanor, from the far side of the room, felt the heat rise in her own face without understanding why. A warmth that started at her collar and spread upward, and she pressed her back flat against the wall as though the plaster could absorb her. The evening unraveled. Eleanor fetched the dowager's shawl. She brought a glass of ratafia and arranged the cushion behind the dowager's back, leaning close enough to smell the lavender water Margaret Ashworth wore, and to feel the older woman's hand brush her wrist, briefly, accidentally, with a tremor that communicated nothing and everything. She stood near the door while the dancing began, her hands folded, her posture the practiced stillness of a woman who had made herself small so many times that smallness had become a kind of skill. The Duke danced once with Sophronia, his hand at her waist correct and remote, his face turned slightly away as though he were listening to something across the room. Eleanor watched. The wire beneath her ribs pulled tight. She turned away and busied herself with the dowager's empty glass. Mrs. Fenimore found her near the refreshment table. The older woman did not address Eleanor directly. She addressed the vicar's wife, who stood beside her, pitching her voice with the practiced accuracy of someone who has spent a lifetime ensuring that the right people overhear the wrong things. "The dowager's little pen girl, nothing more than a scribbler. I am told she has not even a surname worth remembering." Eleanor's hand stopped on the glass. Her breath stopped with it. She set the glass down with great care, because care was the only thing she had left, and she walked to the corridor and stood in the dark passage between the assembly hall and the cloakroom, and pressed her forehead to the cool stone wall and breathed until the breathing steadied. Her hands were shaking. Her hands, which could write 2 pages of perfect copperplate without a single blot, which could dress a burned hand, which could fold a letter so precisely the edges aligned like the seams of a well-made dress, were shaking, and she could not make them stop. She did not see the Duke come through the doorway behind her. She did not see him stop, his frame filling the corridor. She did not see his hand lift toward her shoulder and then fall to his side, a gesture abandoned before it could become something that required explanation. "Miss Graves." His voice was quiet. "Come back inside." "I am quite well, Your Grace." "I did not ask if you were well." "Come inside. Eat something." She turned. His face was shadowed, but his eyes were not. They were fixed on her with the particular intensity of a man who has recently discovered that a letter written in someone else's name can split a wall he has spent 2 years building, and who does not yet know what to do with the rubble. She went back inside. She ate something. She did not taste it. She was aware of exactly where he stood in the room for the remainder of the evening, without once looking directly at him, and that awareness sat in her body like a low hum, constant and unmistakable, and she did not know what to call it, and she did not try. 3 days later, the dowager found the folio. Eleanor had left it beneath her mattress, locked with the brass clasp, where it had lived safely for 5 months. She had not expected the dowager to climb the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor. Margaret Ashworth did not climb stairs. She sent for people. On this particular morning, however, the dowager appeared in Eleanor's doorway, breathing hard from the climb, her face flushed with an exertion that pride would not allow her to acknowledge, and she found the folio open on the bed where Eleanor had been rereading her own words before breakfast. The dowager sat on the edge of Eleanor's narrow bed. The mattress dipped beneath her weight. She picked up the folio and read 3 of the letters, turning each page with fingers that shook so badly the paper rattled in her grip. When she finished, she placed the folio on the bed. She looked at Eleanor, who stood by the window with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her wrists, in her temples, behind her eyes. "You presumed to speak for me," the dowager said. "Your Grace, You wrote to my son, in my name, without my knowledge. You put words in my mouth that I did not say. You meant them, Your Grace." The silence after that sentence lasted long enough for Eleanor to hear the clock in the hall below tick 3 times. Long enough for the light from the window to shift on the wall and reach the edge of the dowager's sleeve. Long enough for the dowager's face to do something it had never done in Eleanor's presence, which was to lose its composure entirely, the muscles around her mouth pulling downward, her eyes brightening with a moisture she blinked away before it could become a tear. Then the composure returned, and the dowager's voice returned with it, thinner than before. The voice of a woman who has just been told a truth she is not ready to hold. "You are dismissed. Pack your things. You will leave before noon." Eleanor packed. Her hands were steady now, because 5 months had taught her that steadiness was a choice, not a condition. She folded her 2 dresses. She placed her father's Bible in the trunk, spine up, the way he had always stored it. She wrapped the writing case with the broken hinge in a cloth. She closed the folio of letters and locked it and placed it on top. She carried the trunk down the stairs herself, step by step, the brass corners scraping the plaster. Mr. Purvis, the old steward, met her in the entrance hall. His face was grave and weathered, the face of a man who had served 3 dukes and 2 dowagers and had learned that the most important conversations in a great house were the ones that happened in hallways. "Miss Graves, the post-chaise will be ready within the hour." "Thank you, Mr. Purvis." He hesitated. His hat was in his hands, turned by the brim. "The Duke has been sent for, miss. He was riding the north boundary this morning. The boy on the fast horse left 20 minutes ago." "It does not matter, Mr. Purvis." "I think, miss, that it does." She stood in the entrance hall with her trunk at her feet, and her hands folded, and her chin level, and her gray dress still faintly marked with ash at the hem from the morning she had knelt on the kitchen floor to help a child she was not required to help. The dowager's door remained closed. Sophronia's carriage was in the drive, drawn up to the front steps with the precision of someone who had been informed of a vacancy and wished to be present when it was confirmed. Through the drawing-room door, Eleanor could hear Sophronia's voice, light and polished and certain. "It is for the best, Your Grace." The girl had ideas above her station. She was merely the pen, after all, and you will find another. Merely the pen, 3 times now. 3 different rooms, 3 different voices. Each one had sounded like the closing of a door, and Eleanor stood in the hall and felt the last door close, and did not flinch, because flinching was a luxury she had never been able to afford. The front door opened. The Duke of Halford came through it in riding boots and a coat streaked with rain, his hair dark with wet, his breath still visible from the ride, his face the face of a man who has crossed a mile of open ground at full gallop, because a steward sent a boy on a fast horse, and the message was 3 words long. He saw Eleanor. He saw the trunk. He saw the drawing-room door standing open and heard the tail end of Sophronia's sentence, the word pen, still hanging in the air like smoke. He stopped. The entrance hall held its breath. Mr. Purvis stood by the foot of the staircase, his hat still in his hands. 2 footmen flanked the front door. The housekeeper had come from the kitchen passage and stood with her hands wrapped in her apron. Annie, the scullery girl, peered from behind the housekeeper's shoulder, her bandaged hand held against her chest. The dowager appeared in the drawing-room doorway, Sophronia half a step behind her in green silk, Mrs. Fenimore visible beyond them near the mantel. And for one held moment, every person in the hall was a witness, and the hall itself was a courtroom. And the verdict was about to be read. The Duke crossed the floor in 3 strides. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at Sophronia. He looked at Eleanor Graves, who stood beside her trunk in a gray dress with ash at the hem, and he reached into the breast pocket of his coat and drew out a letter, folded once, sealed in plain wax the color of tallow, and he held it where every person in the hall could see it. "This letter," he said, and his voice was level and carried to every corner of the stone hall, "was written by Miss Graves. My mother did not ask for it. My mother did not know about it. Miss Graves wrote it because she heard what my mother could not say, and she had the courage to say it in her place. It is the only honest letter I have received from this house in 2 years, the only one that used my name." The dowager's hand went to the doorframe. Her fingers whitened against the painted wood. Sophronia's chin dropped a fraction of an inch, a small descent that contained the first visible tremor of uncertainty she had shown all season. He turned to the dowager. His voice did not soften, but it slowed, each word set down with the deliberate weight of someone laying stones. "She wrote what you could not, Mother. She wrote what you have been trying to write for 2 years. And I know this, because I have read every letter you have sent me, and none of them said what this one says, and the hand that wrote this one was not yours, and the heart that meant it was." The dowager's mouth opened. No sound came. Her hands trembled at her sides, the tremor that she had spent a lifetime concealing now fully visible. And she did not try to hide it. She could not. The words her son had just spoken had stripped away the last wall between her composure and the grief it had been built to contain. The Duke turned back to Eleanor. The hall was silent. The rain had stopped outside, and through the open front door, the light was the pale silver of late morning in autumn, the kind of light that clarifies rather than flatters, that strips a room down to its materials and shows you what is actually there. "Miss Graves is to be my wife." The words fell into the silence the way a stone drops into still water, the surface breaking in circles that widened until they reached every wall. Sophronia's composure fractured. Her lips parted, her hand went to the pearls at her throat, and her eyes moved from the Duke to Eleanor, and back with the rapid calculation of a woman revising a conclusion she had considered settled. Mrs. Fenimore, standing near the mantel, looked down at her own gloves and pressed her lips together and said nothing. The room was very still. "She wrote what I could not," the dowager said. Her voice was thin and raw and carried the sound of something giving way, a wall that had stood for decades, finally recognizing its own weight. "She wrote what I could not." The repetition was not emphasis. It was recognition. Mr. Purvis, standing at the foot of the staircase, removed his hat and held it against his chest. The housekeeper pressed her apron to her mouth. Annie, the scullery girl, clutched her bandaged hand and stared with the wide, unguarded eyes of a child who has just learned that the woman who wrapped her burned fingers in a cold cloth at dawn is someone the Duke of Halford intends to marry. One of the footmen shifted his weight and then straightened, and across the hall, the collective recognition settled like a held note after a bell has been struck. Not a cheer and not a triumph. Only the quiet adjustment of a room that has finally seen something true. The Duke turned to Eleanor. He was close enough now that she could see the rain still caught in the dark wool of his coat, could see the letter trembling in his hand, the way the dowager's hands trembled. A shared inheritance neither of them had chosen, could feel the warmth of him against the cold hall air. He did not touch her. He did not need to. The distance between them was the width of a single step, and the step was hers. "Will you stay, Miss Graves?" Her voice, when it came, was steady. She had chosen it. "Eleanor," she said. "If I am to stay, you will call me Eleanor." His mouth moved. Not a smile. Something smaller and more costly, a fissure in a discipline he had maintained for 31 years. The first visible evidence that the wall behind his face had rooms in it, and those rooms were not empty. "Eleanor," he said. The syllables were careful in his mouth, handled the way one handles something that might break if held too tightly, or not tightly enough. Sophronia gathered her gloves from the drawing-room table without speaking. Her movements were precise, her face composed into the expression of a woman who has decided to leave a room before the room can leave her. Mrs. Fenimore followed. The carriage pulled away over the gravel, and the sound of its wheels diminished and was gone, and the hall was quiet, and the rain had stopped, and the light through the open door had turned from silver to a pale, tentative gold. That evening, the Duke sat with his mother in the drawing-room for the first time in 2 years. Not across the table. Not at a committee distance. He sat in the chair beside hers. The chair the 5th Duke had occupied every evening for 30 years. And the Dowager's hands trembled on the armrests, and she did not try to hide them. She let them shake, and her son saw them shake, and neither of them spoke about it. And the silence between them was a different kind of silence now, the kind that holds rather than divides. At one point his hand moved from the armrest and covered hers, briefly, the way one steadies a glass that has been set down on an uneven surface, and the Dowager's eyes closed, and her chin dipped, and when she opened her eyes again, they were bright, and she let them be bright. Eleanor sat at the writing desk in the corner, the same desk where she had taken dictation every morning for 5 months. She was not writing. The pen lay across the inkwell untouched. She was watching the fire, and she was watching the two of them, the mother and the son, the distance between their chairs no wider than the width of a hand, and the light from the grate moved across her face the way a hand might move across a forehead, smoothing away something that had been held too long and too tightly in the wrong place. On the mantel, in a brass frame the Duke had carried down from his study that afternoon, the portrait of the 5th Duke faced the room again. Beside the portrait, folded once and resting against the frame, the letter sat where the Duke had placed it. Not hidden, not displayed, simply present. The way certain truths become present once someone has had the courage to commit them to paper. The fire settled. The snow began, the first thin fall of the season, soundless against the windows. The room was warm, and the house was quiet. And the woman who had been hired to be invisible sat in the light and was seen. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's story reached you, leave a quiet word below and come back soon.